In a city like New York, community boards and advocacy groups and just regular citizens are really powerful voices in how the city is designed and what kind of transportation the city is investing in. You don't have to be a global thinker. It can just be things in your own neighborhood, and you can have a really powerful voice there. And if there's a road running through your neighborhood that doesn't feel safe and it's hard for kids to cross and it doesn't have a bike lane, you can have a voice in that.
Hello, and welcome to the American Model Podcast, where we explore the ideals of the United States that we hope to preserve and advance. I'm Andrew Marshall, co-founder of Model Leader. This month, we're focusing on the significance of infrastructure as a pillar of American society. Ariel and I recently had the chance to sit down with Polly Trottenberg, whose experience leading in American infrastructure is unmatched. Polly was Commissioner of Transportation in New York City, served as the Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Transportation, and served as the Acting Administrator of the FAA. She currently leads as the Dean of NYU's Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. We dug into her public service motivation, her leadership style, and what makes infrastructure so unifying and valuable in the United States. Please enjoy the stories and experiences that Polly shares in this episode.
Well, thank you, Polly, so much for joining us. We're really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
So, what motivated you to lead in public service?
Yeah, for me, public service was just something that always attracted me, that fascinated me. And as soon as I got into the work, I just fell in love with it. I loved the sense of mission. I really loved my colleagues and the community around it. And so the work just felt important, and I just loved it. I loved it intellectually and emotionally, and I guess sort of spiritually too. And so just when you get into that work over time, you naturally, I think, start to want to take on a bigger leadership role. And I certainly had a few moments in my career where I had a chance to kind of make a big jump in terms of what that role was, and took those chances.
So glad you did. Thank you. Beautiful. You've seen many leaders of different types within government and elsewhere. Who is a leader that you particularly admire?
Yeah, and I've been really lucky. I have worked for a lot of amazing leaders over the years, and I mean, always try and learn something from everybody I work for. But it's interesting. I have an answer sometimes that surprises people on that. One of my favorite leaders was Ray LaHood, who was the Secretary of Transportation in the Obama administration and came in as the only Republican in a Democratic administration. And, which is not always an easy place to be, and came in with a team of political appointees at USDOT, most of whom he'd never met, hadn't worked with over the years. And the way he was able to, I think, embrace us, trust us, delegate to us, turn us into a team, the gratitude I think he showed every day for serving in the Obama administration. He used to say to us constantly, you were part of something so incredibly historic. And it was really inspirational for folks. And he was just a very kind man, a man with many children, many grandchildren, someone who really believed in family and just treated, I think it's a cliche, but treated others as he himself would want to be treated. He's kind of a rare breed in politics, I would say.
Yeah, well put. So our organization is called Model Leader, and it's called that name has kind of two meanings. One, we need more leaders who are models, who are easy to follow, who are actually walking the talk. Two, we believe that it's easier to follow a leader who has a model for leading. They have an approach. You know what to more or less expect from them. How would you describe your approach to leading, your leadership model?
It's an interesting question. And as I say, I've had the opportunity, I think the good fortune to work for a bunch of leaders, learn some good habits and maybe some things that I haven't wanted to do. I think particularly one approaches leadership with humility always. But particularly for me, it has been always important. I've been lucky always, again, as I said, in public service, to work with amazing colleagues and amazing staff. And I always think the first job is to empower and protect and promote them so that they can run and do their jobs. That also, as you move up the ranks in leadership, means delegating, but delegating in the right way, which is, I'm going to turn this over to you to do, and I'm going to support you no matter what you do. If I delegate and then I don't like the results and I get mad at you, I haven't truly delegated. And it's one of the hardest jumps, I think, to make in leadership, particularly if you've been used to being a detailed-oriented person, to let go and empower others to do some of the work. For me, I think it is important. It's something I think the younger generation says a lot that I really believe in, which is being your authentic self, being transparent, sometimes being vulnerable. I make it a big point with my teams to tell them everything I know, to empower people with information. And, look for a lot of consensus when you're trying to make decisions. And at least if you're going to make a decision that people don't like, they've had input, they understand what your thinking was. That said, the flip side of that, and particularly as you get into bigger organizations and operational organizations, people want you to be decisive to some degree. You can't just be in sort of consensus building chat mode forever. At some point, you have to make decisions and get things moving. And for me, that's probably one of the hardest challenges in leadership, getting that balance right. Making sure you are getting consensus and being transparent and getting good decisions, but not getting bogged down in hearing from everybody 50 times. That's probably a place where I maybe tend more towards getting more consensus. And sometimes, I've heard this from my team, sometimes, boss, sometimes just we need you to make up your mind and we need to move ahead.
Hmm. Yeah, those are some of the tightrope walks of leadership. How to balance that empowering, consensus-driven, collaborative style with the decisive, bold leader that people are, inspired to follow.
Yeah, and I would just say this, not everybody wants the same thing from you. I mean, some people tell us what to do and let us get on with it. And some people yes, let's noodle. We'd love to do that. And we have 100 different ideas we want to bounce off you. So it's not even necessarily a one fits all for every person or every scenario. But in a big organization, particularly I was transportation commissioner in New York City, you have, thousands of people that are sort of mobilizing depending on things you're deciding. And you have to make up your mind about things.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna get to some of those stories as well. Very curious about that. So I imagine we'll come back to how you applied that model in New York and elsewhere. Though maybe just broadly, do you have any formative experience that comes to mind that kind of tested your mettle as a leader that really ushered you into the role of a public service leader?
I mean, I guess I'll give two examples, an early one and maybe a later one. I mean, the earliest one, and you probably talk to people, here in the Washington area. For a lot of people, they often make a jump in their career if they're here in Washington from being a staffer on Capitol Hill, as I was for 12 years, to perhaps taking a role in an administration, as I did. I became Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy, a Senate-confirmed role. And that in and of itself is a big jump. And I tell this to young people all the time. It's a big jump to go from being the person behind the person. And those roles can often be powerful. I was a legislative director for many years. Those roles have power in their own right, but you're not the face of your office. You're channeling your boss and you are, somewhat behind the scenes. When you get into a higher level political appointee role, you're the boss. You're at the table. You're setting the policy. And I had the experience of making that jump, going from someone who's writing the speeches to someone who is giving the speeches, and got to do that with a lot of my friends and colleagues from Capitol Hill over the years. Most people could make the jump, but occasionally someone you could see that just they didn't really want to be the front of the organization. They were happier being behind the scenes. So that's a big jump. I think a lot of people make here in Washington, and you can see those parallels in other places. I mean, the other place I really tested my mettle, as I said, I was Transportation Commissioner in New York City during COVID, which was certainly the hardest moment for me in my career, where literally it was life and death. And decisions you made had that kind of impact to them. And, particularly because in New York, we were the first city in the U.S. to really be hit by COVID. We didn't have a playbook for anything. We had no idea really how COVID was spread, what were the best ways to run a safe operation. We had to learn all of that as we went. And it required a lot of experimentation, mobilizing a team that was in a lot of ways, very terrified, and making really big decisions with very little information. And that, I think for everyone who had to lead organizations during COVID, experienced some degree of that. And obviously, look, what we were doing in transportation was life or death. People on the front lines in healthcare, even much more so.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. It really exposes the leader how they operate, their vulnerabilities, how they show up under pressure, how they make decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you just a couple of examples that I think are illustrative. So as COVID descended, of my big team at New York City DOT, understandably, one of the groups that was first the most concerned were our workers for Staten Island Ferry, because they were literally in physical contact with the public. And because the city was really starting to shut down, a lot of places where homeless people might congregate had shut. And so a lot of people gravitated towards the ferry because we made the decision to keep it open 24/7. They were not the first people on my team to get COVID. First people on my team to get COVID were the people who collect money out of parking meters and then go into a small, secure office to count and deposit the money. So they were all in a small enclosed space together. So they gave each other COVID. It was so early in the process, nobody had even thought about it. But suddenly, this entire team of my office had COVID. And it was terrifying. And one of those people died. And it sort of was a moment when we suddenly realized we had to stop every single thing we were doing operationally and transform every bit of it. And look, later, we figured out how to do things outdoors. But in those early days, right, the fear was more for the folks who were actually working outside but working with the public than the people who weren't working with the public but were in this enclosed space. And COVID just constantly presented novel situations, again, where the decision-making was somewhat life or death.
What were some of the values and principles that you used to guide you during that complicated time?
Well, it was interesting. I just, because I had this terrifying experience, which happened so early. And by the way, the person who died, he didn't get it in the office. He got it at his doctor's office, but he died, his wife died, and he infected everybody else. And so I went people first, because at that point there was an incubation period for COVID. So I said, everybody go home. And, it was interesting. I said to my city hall at that time, we're going to stop collecting money out of the meters. And they said, no, you can't stop that. And you know what? We stopped collecting money out of the meters. People weren't paying the parking meters anyway, but I just decided I'm going to make sure all these other folks are okay. And, if City Hall's unhappy with parking meter collections, that's the price I'll pay. As you may remember at that time, then Governor Cuomo in New York was talking about flattening the curve. And it was actually a very helpful way to think about things, because what that meant was separate people as much as you possibly can. And it made me lean, because there was not a lot of central guidance, because I think my city hall, to be fair, was grappling with questions like, how do I get enough ventilators? And I made the decision and worked really closely with those ferry workers and our other, my agency had a bunch of different unions, wound up working really closely with those unions. My first impulse was everybody who can go home, who's not in a life or death operation, go home. And it was funny, I had such dedicated workers, like the person who ran my sidewalks operation, they do a lot of sidewalk repairs, and it's important work. And I said, no, everyone's going home. And we still in the early days of COVID, it was sometimes hard to wrap your mind about what was actually happening. I'm like, no, just go home. So first of all, just, minimize deaths. I mean, and if operations suffered, we'll figure that out later. And look, over time, so many things in the city shut down that it sort of, it regularized itself. But, also creating those partnerships with our unions was really important. And with the ferries, because that was the first place where people were, and they were understandably, they wanted masks, they wanted gloves, they wanted things that at that point, the pipeline wasn't producing at scale. And to the extent that the city could get their hands on those type of supplies, they were giving them to frontline healthcare workers. But, working very closely with our unions to decide for each operation, including, again, those folks collecting money for the parking meters, how do we completely retool it and make it safe? What's the PPE we need? What's the operational tempo? What do we do outdoors? So, in very rapid succession, working with my own agency leadership and our union partners to rethink basically every operation we had and know the things that we were gonna put on hold. I mean, the other biggest thing I did, and I like to joke because it was the most populous thing I ever did as commissioner and also the scariest. As we started to get into the summer, the restaurants in New York City, and look, in other cities too, they were going under. you know, they couldn't open. Some of them could serve some takeout, but it was not enough to sustain them. The restaurants were going under. They were having to lay off thousands of people, and they had come to the city leadership and said, let us do outdoor dining. Because at that time we knew being outdoor, by then we knew outdoors was safe. New York City had this extraordinarily restrictive set of rules around outdoor dining. In a lot of places you had to hire an architect and go to the community, but it was a very complicated and expensive process. And for most little restaurants, they couldn't manage it. And there were even parts of the city, often in sort of outer borough and immigrant areas, where the city's zoning codes wouldn't even let you do it no matter what. So we decided we're going to do outdoor dining. And I said at the time, let's go big or go home, a phrase I later regretted a little bit. And we decided we would create online a self-certification process. And every restaurant would go and they would certify that they knew how to set up, a safe setup in the street, or if they were going to do it on the sidewalk to make it accessible so people in wheelchairs could get through. We thought we'd get a couple thousand. We got, I think, like 8,000 in the first week. And it was very overwhelming. And guess what? Most of them did not know how to self-certify. And they just started setting up all over the place. And, a lot of the setups were not as safe as you would have wanted them to be. And I will admit, it was probably one of my darkest moments on the job. I was sort of shocked at how quickly it happened. And, the sort of, let's throw out the rule book and make things happen. It was a little bit of a like, well, we completely threw out the rule book and things happened really fast. And we went back, one nice thing about New York City, because it's has such a big workforce, we were able to mobilize thousands of people to go out and help inspect all the sites and make sure they were safe. And thank goodness, in the end, it worked out very well. But it's just, for me, a big lesson. And look, people loved it. And it did help save the restaurant industry. And it changed New York. There's still a lot of outdoor dining there. Other cities did it as well. But, a big lesson there about, sort of the greatness of doing big, bold things and throwing out the rule book, but sometimes really skirting with a lot of things that were potentially kind of dangerous.
Yeah.
What keeps you up at night when you think about American infrastructure?
I mean, happily, I'm in academia now, so I don't have to stay up at night about it. But writ large, I think this is a chronic problem in infrastructure, that there's always an impetus to build new things, and it's very hard to find the dollars to continue to maintain the old. And that plays out as a safety question in our transit systems, in our roadways, now sadly in our air traffic control system, where, we saw a fatal incident last January after a lot of years of safe operation. So, I mean, to the extent that anything keeps me up at night, it's just that you constantly need to reinvest in these systems, particularly as they get older. And particularly now, there are a lot of new technologies on the horizon. And it's a hard sell to the public. It's a hard sell to say, like, let's spend the money to fix this old thing that you don't even really notice unless it goes wrong. And that's always been a political challenge.
Yeah. And it feels like infrastructure is sort of quintessential government service. You're not paying attention to it, except in the rare event that something happens. What do you wish the public knew about infrastructure in America?
I mean, I think what I want the public to know, and look, a lot of people, their experience is understandably what they experience when they walk out the door, when they get in their car, when they hop on a train, when they hop on an airplane, but getting to school, getting to work. I mean, it's funny. There's a certain number of people out there. I really noticed this in New York City when I was commissioner. I want to do city master plans and think deeply about the whole city and sort of big strategic questions. And there is a place for that. But that's not how most people think about or experience transportation. They think about it in very personal ways that it affects their daily lives. And, I think I would sort of say to the public, particularly at this time when there is a lot of interest in how do we make our streets safer? How do we provide alternative modes of transportation so that we can reduce carbon emissions, so that we can ensure people can walk and bike safely? The public has a real role in that. In a city like New York, community boards and advocacy groups and just regular citizens are really powerful voices in how the city is designed and what kind of transportation the city is investing in. And just you don't have to be a global thinker. It can just be things in your own neighborhood, and you can have a really powerful voice there. And if there's a road running through your neighborhood that doesn't feel safe and it's hard for kids to cross and it doesn't have a bike lane, you can have a voice in that.
Hmm. Hmm. Well said. What can we learn about people and culture based on the transportation that they use, especially in these urban environments?
I'll give you two answers, because there's the personality of the city answer, but I think there's also the personality of our country, which is also revealed through the history of our transportation system. And yes, I think particularly you're talking about cities that have mass transit systems, because that is, in my opinion, to some degree where you feel the personality of a city. New York has the mightiest transit system in the country. In a lot of ways, the most fascinating and the most diverse. And I'm back in New York City now. I'm riding it a lot, and it never ceases to amaze me the incredible things you see, good and bad, that are happening on any given day in this incredible, far-reaching subway system. DC's system, built later, much more designed sort of to funnel suburban residents into their government jobs and their government-adjacent jobs. So slightly different clientele on any given day. Very different design, didn't come together in the historical way that New York did. New York and Boston are turn of the last century systems. DC, Atlanta, BART out in California are sort of 70s, 70-ish, 80s systems. So there was also just a different aesthetic, a different feeling about what a subway system should be like. And they do reflect the personalities of their cities, but they also, I think, reflect the values. And, I do think we can look around this country, I won't name names, but we can see some pretty big cities that have not done much to invest in mass transit, and the population that those systems could serve. They've, in some cases, made deliberate decisions to invest a lot in highways and not much in mass transit. And that's why I sort of have to get into our national values, because that has been a driving force in American transportation policy since the interstate era.
Hmm.
You I think that's something that fascinates me, is how we can use infrastructure to bring people together and to support communities, when really infrastructure can do either one. It can divide people and communities, or it can bring people together and provide resources. How do you design infrastructure to support and to build and to bring connectivity?
I think the good news is that in this era, we've gotten much better at that as a country. And individual cities and states have gotten better at that too. I mean, we now we'll sort of go back to I think, the worst elements of the interstate era, which, was connecting communities all across the country, but drove a lot of highways through a lot of thriving neighborhoods and urban areas all over this country. And look, there's some really interesting scholarship. One of my colleagues at NYU, Deborah Archer, wrote a book called Dividing Lines. So some pretty interesting scholarship about, how intentional were a lot of those interstate systems driven through particularly Black neighborhoods on purpose, to flatten them, to divide them from the rest of the city, to cut them off from opportunity. I think there was a lot of that's happened in our legacy of interstate building. I think the good news is, as a country, we're starting, in some places more than others, to really grapple with that legacy and to think about ways to knit cities back together where they were ripped apart by highways. It's a really, really difficult thing to do. I was very involved in New York. It's kind of become my signature, unfortunately, be involved in this project, the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, which tore through an enormous swath of Brooklyn and Queens. And in part of Brooklyn, the way I look at it, essentially clear-cutted through neighborhoods. And that happened all over the country. But it takes a lot of money and a lot of consensus to try and undo that damage. And cities grow up around that infrastructure and make use of it. And so it's a monumental task. And one thing I really was proud of in my time in the Biden administration, we created this program, Reconnecting Communities, and put some federal dollars towards helping, particularly cities and states often need to work together, because a lot of times these interstates, they're owned by state DOTs, but they run through urban centers. And so it's important for cities and states to work together to try and find ways they can knit communities back together. I think the country's made some progress, but I think we're backsliding a little bit now, and we have a long way to go.
We talk a lot on this podcast about unity and bridging partisan divides. What was it like working on a bipartisan infrastructure law?
It was great. And, I often make a point even now when I'm speaking to audiences or my students about that bill of pointing out that it really was bipartisan, that it garnered Republican votes, a decent number of them in the Senate and some in the House as well. And there's, as we know, looking at Congress these days, that's pretty rare. It's too rare. And it's one of the things I've always loved about transportation. It has traditionally been a very bipartisan issue. The politics of that bill were interesting. Part of what happened is sort of a bipartisan group of senators got together and actually somewhat bypassed the regular committee process, did work closely within the incoming administration, the Biden administration, and produced, what's interesting is a bill that is the largest investment in American infrastructure in generations, something really important. It's interesting now when I look on it, though, one area that didn't make the cut for that bill was housing, which is now probably, certainly in New York and I think all over the country, the infrastructure area where there is the most pent-up demand and the most need to start building. But it was great to work on that bill. And it is a reminder, there are some areas, even in very politically polarized times, where we can work together. I would also admit this about the bill in retrospect, having sort of helped implement it and lived with it now for 5 years. It's a very complicated bill, created a lot of new programs. Sort of the way you buy people into a big piece of legislation like that is there's a little something for everybody. And as a result, the bill's complicated. Probably too many programs and sort of to make everybody happy, a lot of steps to everything we did. And, one improvement that I would make if I could going forward, streamline a lot of what was in there and sort of enable whatever is an incoming administration to hit the ground running a little faster on some of these programs.
Well, congrats on getting it to where you got it and what you did, which is, again, as you said, pretty rare. Okay, you ready for a lightning round?
Okay.
All right. We'll start with a softball. What do you do for fun?
Well, I'm very lucky. Right now, I'm living in Greenwich Village in New York City, so I'm really just loving spending time in the city, art, theater, restaurants. I love to do walking tours, just walk around the city. And because it is America 250, I've been really enjoying a lot of historical sites, particularly this year, and actually here in Washington, in Philadelphia, in New York, up in Boston, and we'll actually be going later this summer to Saratoga and to Fort Ticonderoga. So a full America 250 experience.
All right. Well, you'll be glad to hear on the 4th of July, we were in New York, saw the Blue Angels. We went to the 9/11 Memorial, did Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty. So it was a very 4th of July day.
Great tour, huh? It was very hot, though.
It
Oh,
was hot.
it was miserably hot, unfortunately.
What was your first job?
I mean, my first job other than babysitting, which I guess doesn't count in this world, I got to work when I was in high school at a movie theater in Harvard Square. It doesn't exist anymore in Cambridge, called the Galleria, where when I started, they said, you could have all the popcorn you want, but you'll get sick of it. And I never got sick of it. And it was kind of an artsy theater. It was showing at that time a movie called From Mozart to Mao. And it was Itzhak Perlman visiting China. And performing and then sort of hanging out with some Chinese musicians. I must have seen the movie 30 times.
That's fascinating. Well, we've talked about music before and a shared love of music. If this is a super curveball question that I just made up. If your career were a song, what song would it be?
That is a curveball.
Screwball question, maybe more
yeah.
like.
There's a Beatles song I really like. It's very ethereal and pretty. It's called It's All Too Much. That's what comes to mind off the top of my head.
All right.
It's good.
All right. So I'm going to follow that up with another question. What's been the most stressful job? You've been acting administrator of the FAA. You've run transportation in New York, deputy secretary of transportation, a dean at NYU, and others on the Hill. What's been the most stressful?
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, they've all had their stresses. Maybe it's been one of the hallmarks of my career that I, gravitate towards jobs that have a fair amount of stress to them. I think as I said before, transportation commissioner is an amazing job in New York City. I mean, it's an extraordinary experience, but, people in Washington, actually, when I first went to New York, would ask me, "What's the difference between New York and DC?" And at that time, maybe it's a little different now, I would say in New York, the highs are high and the lows are low. But the lows are when things are really going badly, dark moments in COVID, or I had other moments where employees got killed on the job, like, where you're getting blasted online and on the front page of newspapers. I mean, with the sort of incredibly impactful and high profile jobs, it can also really be some very tough and stressful moments. And look, I always say this now to anyone I know who's doing high profile public service work, like, thank you. It's very hard. And, I think the public grows ever more demanding. I think social media just takes its toll on folks. So those high profile jobs are the most amazing jobs, but I think they can sometimes be the most stressful. They can be life and death.
Mm. Well, we'll break the middle of this lightning round to say thank you for your service. Really, all that you've offered, Polly. And another, kind of, and this also is maybe departing from lightning round a little bit as well. How do you manage your stress? What do you do as a leader to manage when you have the pressure that you have?
Yeah, and look, I have some tricks, but I'm probably not the best at it. One thing I did particularly learn when I was commissioner, when you're taking a lot of public incoming, so to speak, and my husband was helpful in this, you really do have to compartmentalize. It's not easy to do, and I think for women it's particularly hard. We really take it to heart when someone is ripping us to shreds online, but you have to be able mentally, I think, to develop a bit of toughness. And I would often, when I started on the job, someone gave me an amazing piece of advice, and it's really worked for me at stressful moments. They said to me, just come in and do your best every day. And, there are days when you come in and things are going wrong and you're second guessing yourself. And sometimes, like you screwed it up. Like, when you have big jobs, you sometimes make big mistakes. It's inevitable. But, sort of to come back to that North Star of I came in and did my best. And, if there's a problem, we're gonna problem solve. I think I do have a good quality maybe that's helped me through the years. When people start to freak out, I often sort of get calm at that moment. Not always, but just my temperament to kind of like, let us sit and calm ourselves here. And, this is a tip I give everyone in any business they're in, that age-old question when you're having a stressful moment, like, will this matter in 5 minutes? Will this matter in 5 hours? Will this matter in 5 days? Now the first question I jokingly say in academia is like, is anyone dead? And if the answer is no, I'm like, okay, well then we already know and look, I don't mean to, some important things are happening in academia right now. Freedom of speech, students, whether they can continue their educations, people are losing their jobs. I don't mean to say there aren't some big important things happening there, but always it's a good reminder, if it's not life or death, let's take a deep breath and problem solve.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Really good wisdom. Okay. I'm going to jump back to lightning round. Favorite mode of transportation?
My own 2 feet.
That would probably be yours too. As someone who's walked the Camino de Santiago, it probably,
It's a nice different pace from how we usually seeing the world.
hmm What's the most underrated transit city in the US?
You know, it's interesting. I'm actually going to say Washington because I think there's a lot of snobbery about it. And it's a very difficult system to manage because politically you're having to juggle 4 jurisdictions: Maryland, Virginia, the District of Columbia, and the federal government. And it's run really, really well. And, you mentioned it sort of feels like a more orderly system. That's because a lot of great leadership. And by the way, a lot of great men and women who help make the system run. And I think people here sometimes take it for granted, and they shouldn't. It runs really well under pretty complicated circumstances.
Yeah, we like it too. Yeah. Um, let's see. What's one item you never travel without?
Guess at this point I'd have to say my phone, right?
Yeah, yeah. You need that. You need to have that with you. I'll take this question from the Colbert questionnaire: window or aisle on an airplane?
Oh, I always take the window because my husband needs the aisle.
Okay. Okay. And last question from the lightning round. Craziest thing that you've seen on a subway?
I remember one morning I was getting on the subway early. This is, I think, when I lived down in the East Village, and I was headed to Penn Station. First of all, I get on the train, and there is a full-on Klingon, complete costume, speaking in Klingon, and this is early in the morning. I mean, magnificent, like really a magnificent Klingon. Within a couple of seconds, and look, this was really deadly. A couple of little boys have grabbed on, stuck their hand in the door, and are riding the car on the outside. A few minutes after that, someone was having a real, I guess we would call it sort of an emotional moment. Like this, all this was sort of at like 7 in the morning. This all happened within about 5 minutes. And it was, it's, so many years later, I still vividly remember like, wow, this is a lot to take in this early in the morning on the subway. But, you know, the New York City subway is full of all kinds of fascinating moments.
That is quite the image you just created. Well, I hope that they're all living long and prospering from that moment.
I hope the little boys are. It's actually not something to laugh about. There has been a series, unfortunately, recently of teenagers killing themselves, you know, doing crazy riding outside the doors or riding on cops. For instance. It's incredibly dangerous, so we shouldn't laugh about it. And young folks don't do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So if the resources weren't a question and we really were investing in our infrastructure in the United States in really creative new ways, thinking about transportation moving forward, what would be some of those things you'd like to see?
It's not complicated, and I think you can look to parts of Europe and Asia and probably see some of what we wish we had here, which is really well-funded transit systems all over the country, and not just for the big cities, but for smaller communities. Investing in really great modern technology and being able to support frequencies and long hours for service, and service that can build out to communities that have been really underserved. Like that for me has always been at the top of my list. As a country, we've dramatically underinvested in mass transit. And, you know, we can look to our European and Asian counterparts and see what they have done. It would be great to build out more of a national rail network. That takes big investment and big commitment for decades to come. I don't think have summoned the will to do that yet in the United States, but it would be fantastic if we could. And then again, just as someone who got to manage local streets in New York City, I hope we will continue, I think, the journey that a lot of American cities have been on to think about their streets not just as places for cars to drive fastly, but as places for walking, for biking, designed in a way that feels more safe and humane and more accessible to everybody. Walkers, bikers, people in wheelchairs, young kids, seniors, you name it.
So there's a lot of people that have a lot of time to sit and think about transportation solutions while they're in traffic. What do you think are actually research-based, the best solutions for areas that are really just traffic heavy, where like the DC area and other metro areas?
So one thing I used to say in New York when people would be sitting in traffic saying, do something about the traffic, I would say, you are the traffic. So, I mean, first of all, you have to, you may be wanting a solution, but you're also part of the problem. I mean, I think the answers there aren't complicated. It's providing alternatives. I'll give you an amazing statistic that I've talked about before. When I was commissioner in New York, at one point, it didn't come to pass. It was a long saga, but the city was going to have to close the subway train, the L train, which runs across 14th Street in Lower Manhattan into Brooklyn. The tunnel had been damaged in Hurricane Sandy. They found an easier way to do it, but for a time it looked like we were going to have to close off that train line for a while. Here is a statistic I learned. If you are familiar with New York City, during the morning rush hour from 8 to 9, this was true pre-COVID. It may be a little different, but I think the order of magnitude is probably the same. You have more people riding on the L train than you have driving in the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, the Brooklyn Bridge, the Manhattan Bridge, the Williamsburg Bridge, the Queens Midtown Tunnel, and the Queensboro Bridge. Just to give you a sense of the power of mass transit versus what you can do with roadway capacity. So in the end, I mean, one of the solutions to traffic is going to be finding ways to move more people more efficiently. That's very hard to do in parts of the country that don't have the land use patterns to support that. That is sort of the struggle in a lot of the American context. In dense cities, you can really make that work. But when you have very sort of sprawling residential patterns and sprawling workplace patterns, it's very hard to get that critical mass of people who want to ride mass transit for whom it is going to work. So that gets to a deeper question, which is how do we do land use in the United States? How do we better plan putting housing and economic opportunities together? You get into some deeper questions, but in the long run, that's going to be part of the solution to our traffic problems. One thing we've seen in a lot of cities, you can keep building roadway lanes, but they tend to just fill up. It doesn't really solve your problem. Looking to other modes and finding, I think, better ways to do better land use planning is the longer term solution to that problem of sitting in traffic.
That's a fascinating statistic. Actually, when I was in New York doing some work with Joanna Noonan up on Long Island, I tried to use every form of transportation I could. So it was like train, bus, cab, bike, feet. I'm not sure what I missed, but
Ferry? Did you ferry?
I did not ferry. No, there was no ferrying. But it just gives you such a sense of how many people can move quickly. And also a sense of the place and the people and the perspective. So good plug for that. As we wrap up here, Polly, obviously as we celebrated the 250th, we're thinking ahead to the next 250. And you're working with young people. What is the message you're sharing with them around public service, around what are you sharing to motivate the rising generation?
Yeah, no, and I'm so lucky because here I am. I'm now dean of a school of public service, graduate school of public service, and I have to say, my students are wonderful. You know, a lot of Gen Zers, not entirely, but you know, a new generation coming on the scene. You know, sort of finding themselves politically, and you know, New York City obviously helped elect a popular new mayor who is doing wonderful things, and I think really just you know, creating a real sense of excitement and possibility, even as look for a lot of people, you know, what's happening at the national level, you know, feels pretty challenging. I encourage my students, and look, a lot of them don't need encouragement. They've come to a school of public service because they're already committed. But I always talk about my own career and what's been so amazing about it, and just that I think there's no more rewarding work. And I also tell them I'm looking at them now to make the change that we need, you know, to be the change that they seek, that I have a lot of faith in them. I do think this younger generation they're already starting to do some great things. And I think they're going to do more. And that's good. I'm excited about the generational turnover that's happening in American politics. It's overdue.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. Anything else we want to share, Ariel?
Just so appreciate your time. This has been really, really wonderful.
Well, thank you guys.